Right, it's time to get started. So I'm going to hand over to Rob, who's going to lead us in the history of Lutheran liturgy. Like I said before, you can get up and make coffees whenever you want. We're giving Rob 35 minutes, and we'll see how long he actually takes.
All right. I believe I'm wired for sound, which is good. I wish that I could hear as well as I am being heard right now. But as some of you may notice, I'm often doing this because I'm just recovering from a cold. And it's not because I'm the oldest person here, because, well, I guess I am. But so think of me as an elderly grandfather, but it's because still in my 70s, I get the same kind of ear infections I got when I was 4 or 5, and it puts me underwater for a few days when I have a bad cold. So that's what I am suffering from right now. It sounds like people on the left of me are speaking through a fishing pool or something like that. Anyway, history of liturgy, as I mentioned last night, is something that I have delved into many, many times over the years as a musician, and then only in recent years as a lecturer to Lutherans, to laymen, and sometimes to seminarians. And I have had an interesting time getting into the background of why we worship the way we worship. Now, personally, this is something I encountered as an adult because I was not raised Lutheran. I was fortunate enough to run in, while I was in graduate school, to run into a faithful Lutheran musician, a fellow student, who caught my attention, and I caught hers as well, and we have made music together ever since. But when I started attending church with her, it was a little different from what I was used to, because as a Presbyterian, I was not aware of much form in the services I went to. So how many of you were not raised in a Lutheran background? Okay, so I'm sure that several of you would have similar experiences. If you are Catholic, of course, obviously you've dealt with liturgical backgrounds, or maybe Anglican. But historically, the forerunners of the Presbyterian Church, the Calvinists, Zwingli and Jean Calvin, they took a much different approach from Martin Luther long ago in determining how their worship service should be organized. Martin Luther wanted to purge the service of anything that was anti-Christian, the things that had crept into it that were not appropriate. John Calvin had a much more radical approach. He looked at the scriptures and he said, we should not do anything in our service that isn't specifically determined by the scriptures. And the only music that he could see was the Psalms. So he said, there should not be any singing in church except for Psalms. There should not be any instruments, no organ, no flutes, no trumpets. And so the early Calvinist services were very bare bones. Modern Calvinist churches do not follow that. And so there was plenty of music in the church where I was growing up, but it was very variable. And as for a sequence of readings, a sequence of chants, anything like that. I was unaware of it. Maybe there was some that was determined, or that the pastor knew about, but I didn't know that. Anyway, I tended to encounter sacred music in the form of the great masters like Bach and Mozart and Haydn and Schubert and Beethoven, music that I still appreciate, which can be appropriate in a divine service, but for most of us, including myself as a musician, I encountered that in the concert hall. This was music that you would get in a choral concert or something of that sort. So my first reaction in attending services with the gal who is and has been my wife for 44 years now was something of a bewilderment, because there were things that were in a very specific order. There were some things that obviously were the same every time because that they were in the hymnal, and other things that changed. That included the scripture readings, but also some other things as well. And for someone encountering it the first time, it seems rather confusing, and even for an experienced churchgoer, it's sometimes hard to keep track of it. So I hope that I can go over enough of this that you'll start getting a handle on, or getting an understanding of how we got there and how logical it is in the final analysis. I want to go back to, I want to begin with a quote which I encountered in a book by C.S. Lewis many, many years ago, long before I knew what Lewis was talking about. But this little paragraph, it was such a wonderful thought that I've kept it with me. I made a nice, when I was doing calligraphy, I did a very artistic rendering of it. I should try to get that so we can put it on the screen tomorrow. It's in his book, Letters to Malcolm. How many of you know that book? C.S. Lewis, Letters to Malcolm. The subtitle is Chiefly on Prayer. The very first letter is the only one that deals with corporate prayer, which of course means gathering together for worship. And he says, as long as you notice and have to count the steps, you're not yet dancing, but only learning to dance. A good shoe is a shoe you don't notice. Good reading becomes possible when you need not consciously think about eyes or light or print or spelling. The perfect church service would be one we were almost unaware of. Our attention would have been on God. So that's sort of the essence and the gift of liturgy, the development of habits of worship that make us comfortable but not bored, with familiar, unchanging parts mixed in with a predictable sequence of variable parts. And when we get to know it, it allows us to concentrate on God, on God's message, and on God's gifts. It may not be friendly to the visitor who comes once or twice, who may have a hard time keeping up, but it rewards those who take the time to become familiar with it. And that's what the essence of liturgy is, something that, well, the word liturgy means work, and it's sort of what God does for us, but it's also something that we do in the service to receive what God has given us. But of course, there's undeniable complexity to all of this. And we as Lutherans pay a great tribute to what Martin Luther has done. But what Martin Luther did in terms of liturgy was mostly conservative. He kept most of what was the liturgical practice that he inherited. And he was especially careful at the beginning because he had found himself the leader of a new group of Christians, and he did not want to disrupt their spiritual life any more than was necessary at the time. So at the very beginning, in fact, he didn't even change the language from Latin to German. It was only a few years before he did start recommending that the service be in the vernacular of the people. But there were a few parts of the service, of the Mass, that he really objected to because of his radical understanding of the gospel, what he had learned in his study of the scriptures, especially his detailed study of the book of Romans, and all that he learned in his translation of the New Testament, and then later on with help the Old Testament. And in a way, his biggest contribution is something that was kind of incidental at first, because the divine service, the main service, of course, we don't get any example of that here in our camp this weekend, but we're all familiar with the divine service. Hymns are a big part of that for us. But the divine service, or the Mass, before Luther, didn't have hymns. Almost never was a hymn in that. And so it was after he started writing about the Mass and what he wanted the Mass to be with his followers, he recommended the use of some hymns, the writing of new hymns for the people. Well, the history of liturgy, as we heard in the sermon this morning, the combination of word and music, God's word and music, was God's idea. But the specifics of it, of course, bear a lot of the signs of human interaction. And the history of liturgy is rather difficult, and it's not an area of my expertise, and I've always thought that when I do my lectures on this, that it's the least effective of what I have to say because there's so little known about the first few centuries of Christian worship. We'd like to know how the church fathers worshiped when they got together, but there's a lot that is obscure because it wasn't really written down. There are a few descriptions of early services and the types of chanting that was done, the types of sermons, and the celebration of the Lord's Supper. It really starts to come into focus with the Emperor Constantine and the legitimacy of Christianity in the 300s, when it was finally possible for Christians to meet together in large groups And then, because there was distances to cover in these worship areas, and pre-planning had to be made so that a service could be addressed to a large group rather than something like just a household, then there were written evidence about what that entailed. And it was during that time that the beginnings of what came to be known as Gregorian chant were developed and became unified because of the dominance of the Church of Rome in the Christian world. I think the next session I have tomorrow, I'm going to bring in a few examples of early Gregorian chant, and then later on some other sacred music that I'll have in a speaker. But the Roman rite, which is behind a lot of how we still worship, was due to the primacy of the bishop in Rome, who became known as the vicar of Christ, or the Pope, the Father. And probably the most important single person there in the establishment of worship as we know it would be Gregory, roughly around 600 AD, who legend has it that he composed many of the melodies. That's unlikely, but he certainly oversaw the unification of these. For a musician like me, what's interesting then is that those early melodies could not be written down. No one knew how to write down musical notation at that time. And so it was a number of centuries before some rather simple ideas about writing melodies came about. At first, it was little marks above the text, probably sort of mnemonic devices so that if someone already knew the melodies, they could remember them more accurately, but that someone who did not know those melodies would have no way of singing them specifically. But it was a first step at representing the ups and downs of a melody on paper, or on vellum, or on parchment, or whatever. And so between 600 and 1000 AD, these developed to the point where it was actually possible to write down specific pitches so that when a melody went up, that the singers would know how far it had gone up and how far to go down. And notations from that time are still readable in terms of pitch, but not in terms of rhythm. So we don't know how long they were on each of those notes, and it may have varied from one singer to another. Now, the origins of this chant are probably tied to the practices of the synagogue. And there are many times, of course, in the Old Testament when there are references to what sounds like musical performance. The Psalms especially. Psalm 150 is the most elaborate. Praise him with fanfares on the trumpet, upon the lute and harp, with tambourines and dancing, with flute and strings, with the clash of cymbals. But elsewhere in the Old Testament, like in Nehemiah, there's the dedication of the repaired wall of Jerusalem. And there is a description of what looks like antiphonal singing. To celebrate the dedication with gladness, with thanksgiving and singing, with cymbals and harps and lyres. Then I appointed 2 great choirs that gave thanks, and certain of the priests' sons with trumpets, and others with musical instruments of David, the man of God, and the joy of Jerusalem was heard far away. Now that was probably not synagogue practice. It was a large celebration. In the synagogue, it was more likely to be just the chanting of psalms. But according to a description by Justin Martyr, who was writing about a Sunday Eucharist in Rome about 150, where he mentions readings from the prophets and apostles, sermons, prayers, and acclamations, but he actually did not mention any psalms. So this earliest Christian liturgy doesn't seem to correspond to a later Gregorian liturgy, which is centered very much around psalmody. So the chanting of psalms was probably not a part of the very first services, perhaps because the early Christians were distinguishing themselves from their Jewish contemporaries. Another early account of a Christian service around AD 400, a Spanish nun visiting Jerusalem, she described a night service, one before cockcrow, which was a monastic gathering along with a few lay people singing hymns and psalms and antiphons with some prayers. Perhaps at that time the psalms had become more part of the monastic life. And in fact, a very, very big influence on music in early Christianity was monasticism. It was those who desired to withdraw from the larger culture to live a pure, more spiritual life. And the Edict of Milan in 3313, which was the officially gaining approval of the authorities in Rome, and within the 300s, Christianity went from being anathema, from being not allowed, to being the official religion. And so it's as if Christianity now had the power and authority that it had formerly struggled against. And many Christians felt that what they perceived as a pompous hypocrisy is something that they wanted to flee from. So some, like the famous Saint Anthony the Abbot, they sought to become a hermit, while others, like Saint Basil, the Bishop of Caesarea, conceived of the monastic life as a communal living, devoted to obedience, prayer, and fellowship. And so the monastic life was devoted to people trying to get away from society and live the pure Christian life. And a big part of what they were, what their communal living gathered on was what they called the vigil. The vigil was a recitation of all of the Psalms, the entire book of Psalms, in one night. And so to stay awake, they would do this in unison. And St. John Chrysostom said, "Many who have no knowledge of letters nevertheless know all of David," by which he meant the book of David's Psalms, and can recite them from beginning to end. It wasn't until about 520 that there was some sort of practical order that was brought to this life, and it's something that still impacts us in terms of our worship practice, and that was the order of Saint Benedict. In that, he took the verses from Psalm 119 that says, "7 times I praise you," and he says, this should mean that we have at least 7 times during the day when we gather to recite Psalms. And the order of Saint Benedict was a lot more than that. It was about regulating life among the monks in a monastery. And it was fairly strict, but it was awfully practical, and that meant that it really did work, and it was adopted by many different monasteries from 520 on. It's still in use by some groups of monks. And the division of the day into hours with the 8 services. Originally it was 7 plus a nighttime service, and it was made into 8 services. The nighttime service came not in the middle of the night, but after the monks had a reasonable sleep, and so that was called matins. And then there was one called lauds. Then there were 4 shorter ones during the day: the 1st hour, the 3rd hour, the 6th hour, and the 9th hour, prime, terce, sext, and nones. And then there was a longer evening service, which was vespers, and then there was a very short bedtime service, which was compline. And the center of all of these was the reciting of psalms, especially at Matins. Matins was in the life of the monastery was quite elaborate, easily the longest of any of those services, and would involve the chanting of at least 9 psalms. The ideal that St. Benedict wrote in his rule was that all 150 psalms should be covered every week. And he said that the early monks did this all in one night. So if we, lazy as we are, can manage it in a week, we should have no complaints. And that means that each one of those little services had its own little liturgy in which the opening would be similar to each one, would be the same, and then there would be a reading, which would be, it was called a capitulum, a chapter from the Bible, and there would be a hymn. Interestingly, during this time, the Mass did not have any hymns, and and then there would be one or more psalms. And all of these were done according to some rather strict formulas. Most psalms would begin with an antiphon, which was a single verse from a different psalm, and then the psalm would be recited verse by verse, and then that antiphon would return. All of this is of great interest to musical historians because these forms, the beginning, the middle, and then the beginning as the final part, makes a well-rounded 3-part form which shows up again and again and again in all types of music. The modern use, of course, of these is unknown to most Christians, unless you're a member of a liturgical church, and then you're aware, oh yeah, there's this service without Holy Communion that we call Matins, or in some Lutheran hymns it's called morning prayer, basically the same thing. And there's an evening service called Vespers. And so I think we're all familiar with those services. But at monasteries these days, in the US, in Europe, I imagine there are monasteries in Australia, I suppose so. They still follow the 8 times a day. Anyhow, I have abbreviated the first third of my talk a bit because I don't have much time as usual, and we got a little bit of a late start. Josh, should I be closing up in the next couple of minutes?
Yes, you have 3 minutes.
Okay,
So
very good. Very
that
good.
includes question time.
Oh, okay. Well, I do want to apologize. I think that the first third of what I have to present is the least organized because there's so much confusion in it, and I wish I were more of an expert on it. Once we get talking about the Mass, the main service, then it's much easier to be specific, and I'll probably have some more useful stuff. And also, I had planned on everybody having a handout, and that didn't happen. And so I will see if I can work with the PowerPoint so that I've got some clear images for you, some clear tables for you to look at the next time we meet, which is tomorrow morning. Are there any questions? I probably won't be able to hear them.
If
Actually,
you
I
have
will.
a question, make sure
Yeah,
you use a
I can,
microphone so that the recording picks it up. Levi's the runner. This one.
Hi, Rob. I was just going to ask for a clarification. When you said that there were no hymns in the Mass, do you mean no like hymns sung by the congregation, or does that even mean the choir didn't sing hymns?
Oh, yeah. The Mass, up until the time of Martin Luther, had no use for the hymns. The offices, they did have hymns. Now that would not be for a general congregation, it would be for a congregation of monks. And it was with Luther, as I'll go into much more detail later on. He thought that spiritual songs, which is what he called them at first, would be useful in the divine service in a couple spots, and also during the distribution of the elements. And when he first mentions it in 1520 or 23, I think it is, it's kind of like, well, this is sort of a good idea, not like he puts a great deal of importance on it, but almost immediately he started writing hymns himself. We know Martin Luther as a great hymn writer. He had written almost nothing before 1523, and 2/3 of his own personal output came in the next 1 year. And that was really the beginning of hymn writing. And so I'll have some more to say about hymns, not nearly as much as my wife does. That's her specialty. Yes.
One last question from Taz down the front.
Thank you. Can you give us an indication of why Matins and Vespers has been generally chosen as the alternate, those hours that we are familiar with as opposed to the others?
Oh, it's probably because they are the more elaborate services. And in modern Lutheran practice, if for some reason there is no celebration of the Lord's Supper, then it's possible to have a Mass without the Lord's Supper, which in a way seems kind of pointless, because the Lord's Supper is the culmination of that service. And so Lutheran hymnals sometimes have a service which is the same as the divine service with Holy Communion, but leaving out the Holy Communion. But having a service of Matins, which is kind of well-rounded, and every Matins, let me go back just a little bit. Of the 8 offices, the first 2 and the last 2 are the major ones. The 4 in the middle are the minor ones. And the reason for that was simply so that the monks could get some work done during the day. These were very short services: prime, terce, sext, nones. But the one before the 4 short ones, the 4 minor hours, matins, and the one just after, vespers, those were the more elaborate ones, and each one had especially a canticle of the Te Deum or the Benedictus or the Magnificat. And so they're more well-rounded services with more readings and always with at least one hymn.
Thank you, Rob, so much for your first session, giving that background history for some of the liturgy and some of the offices, different services we have in our church. We do need to take a 5-minute break, and then we're on to the study 2 with Pastor Jacob. So we're moving on pretty quick.